morning. Beginning with beloved. This is Jen Richardson. From Mark 1:11, and a voice came from heaven, "You are my son, the beloved." Begin here, beloved. Is there any other word needs saying? Any other blessing could compare with this name, this knowing? Beloved. Comes like a mercy to the ear that has never heard it. Comes like a river to the body that has never seen such grace. Beloved. Comes holy to the heart, aching to be new. Comes healing to the soul, wanting to begin again. Beloved. Keep saying it, and though it may sound strange at first, watch how it becomes part of you. How it becomes you, as if you never could have known yourself anything else. As if you could ever have been anything other than this, beloved.
In the hymnal, number 483, 483, O God who gives us life. And if you're willing and able, I'd like to stand. And also, just a reminder to remember to listen for the melody as you sing parts. O God who gives us life and breath, who shapes us in the womb, who guides our lives from birth to death, then leads us from the tomb. Deliver us from fears that kill the life we have from you. Help us to know your Spirit still is making all things new. O God who calls your people out to venture and to dare, to plumb the bleak abyss of doubt and find you even there. When we despair in wandering through wastes of empty lives, refresh us with the living spring of hope that never dies. O God of covenant and law, revealed in cloud and flame, your mighty deeds evoke our awe. We dare not speak your name, yet we by faith are drawn to you, and will your people prove. As on our hearts to write unto the covenant of love. And say in the same book, number 375. 375. Heal us, Emmanuel, here we are. And we chose this song because it refers to the text that Paul will be using this morning. And why don't we start with just the melody? Because the rhythm is a little bit different. Heal us, Emmanuel, where we are. We wait to feel thy touch. Deep wounded souls to be repaired, and Savior, we are such.
is feeble, we confess. We faintly trust thy word, but wilt thou pity us the less? Be that far from thee, Lord. Remember him who once applied with trembling for relief. Lord, I believe, with tears he cried, oh, help my unbelief. She too who touched thee in the breast, and healing virtue stole, was answered, daughter, go in peace, thy faith hath made thee whole. Like her with hopes and fears we come to touch thee if we may. Oh, send us not despairing home, send not unhealed away.
And finally, for the third song, I'd like to do a song from Mennonite World Conference, Mungu ni Mwema. We don't have those books, but you really don't need it for this song. It's a song from Africa, somewhere, and I wish I could say, I should know. Look that up for you. Anyway, it's essentially the song "God is so good." It's even the same, essentially the same melody and chords. So if you sing, God is so good, God is so good, God is so good to me. But with a little different flair, it's Mungu ni mwema, Mungu ni mwema, Mungu ni mwema, ni mwema, ni mwema, Mungu ni mwema, Mungu ni mwema, Mungu ni mwema, ni mwema, ni mwema, Mungu ni mwema, Mungu ni mwema, Mungu ni mwema, ni mwema. Know that God is good. 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 God is good. God, hallelujah. 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 Mungu ni mwema. Mungu ni mwema. Mungu ni mwema. Ni mwema. Ni mwema. Thanks.
I believe that's Kiswahili.
Thank you.
Pretty sure. That's fun. We're glad to have you all here this morning in our final session. We want to make sure that we are thanking everyone that's made this weekend possible, certainly our planning committee and we've all involved a lot of work into making all this happen. Each of our speakers and presenters, thank you so much for your dedication to your topics, your experiences, and being willing to share about them here with us. We also want to make sure that we should thank our wonderful worship leaders, Daryl and Louise. You guys brought us together with music and words beautifully. And some pieces of this morning's worship, we will have our offering, which will be kind of explained in a little different way. We have an interview with Miriam or Godshall by Stan and Susan. If you guys want to make your way up here, so you can talk about that, kind of lay out what we are collecting our funds for. And then after that, I will introduce our speaker, Paul Leichty this morning, and we'll have communion presentation.
I'm happy to introduce to you my big sister, Miriam, who, when I was 16, she decided to do voluntary service with Eastern Mennonite Board in Elkhart, and they assigned her to Ay Bonito, Puerto Rico, for 2 years, and she went there and never came back. She was there 57 years, and during that time, she became a midwife. She took midwifery training at San Juan and delivered over 4,600 babies in a country where obstetricians don't like midwives to do their job. So it was interesting that she was able to do this. And she received the governor's award, and also the mayor of Ay Bonito made her a hijo, hija. Hijo. My Spanish is there. Sister of Ay Bonito. And Susan, she decided that when she hits 80, she probably should leave the island, although she didn't want to, but that was the decision. And on August 6th, this past year, Susan and I and my other sister went down to, at the invitation of the church, for a farewell, which lasted all day, for her, August 6th, and she was ready to leave, but the house wasn't sold. VMRC in Harrisonburg didn't have the room ready, so she waited and waited, and then Hurricane Irma came along and skirted the upper part and damaged, they damaged them a bit, but not too bad, but then on the 20th of September, Maria really devastated the island. And we were up there up in Harrisonburg not knowing what was going on. So we're happy she's here, and I have a few questions. First of all, just tell us, ma'am, how it was like going through the storm, and were you alone, or how was it?
Well, I wasn't alone, because my friend, Aileen Malone, who was the president of the Mennonite disaster in Puerto Rico, she said, I know my roof is going to go with 155 miles an hour winds. And can I stay at your house? I said, yes, you can, and I don't have to be by myself. And she came and stayed with me that night, and we got along fine. Anyway, the 18th of September, they told us to prepare for the hurricane. Well, since I had prepared for hurricanes quite a few times, I thought, well, you can just have to get the water, and you have to get batteries, and also I went to the stores to get the batteries for my flashlights. Well, I couldn't find any batteries. Everybody had bought them out the day before, and I got there late, so I didn't have any. So I went to get some water, so we carried buckets of water to the house, so we had that for our bathroom and all. But the storm didn't come that night. But 19th of September, the storm winds started to come, and Aileen came to my house and said she'd stay. I said, well, that's good. And the 20th is when Maria came with much wind. Telephone poles were broken in half. Trees were down, wires were down everywhere. It was really a disastrous place at that time. There were many houses who lost the roofs of their house. My house was a cement house and didn't have the tin roofs like many of them did. So I didn't have not much damage to my house at all at that time. And during the night, we heard the roofing from other houses flying through the air, and I thought, oh my, soon they'll hit my windows, and I'm gonna have broken windows, then what am I gonna do? But I didn't get any windows broken. In the afternoon, the heavy rain stopped a little bit, and I went back into my behind my house to check what was all going on down there. I found 17 pieces of long tin that had come from other people's houses and all landed in my backyard. And a lot of glass from broken windows from neighbors' houses.
How did the church and the community function? How did the church help and how did the community function?
Well, our pastor tried to tell us we have to be patient and just don't get mad, and when you have to wait in line, you have to wait in line. And so we tried to do that at that time. And many cars were waiting in line to get gas, and some of them used to leave and then come back again. And you could only buy $10 worth of gas, that's all at the time. There was no communications with families in the States or in Puerto Rico. No radio, no TV, no cell phones, or computers. Lines of people were waiting at the bank, hoping to get cash before it was all gone. The first time I went to the bank, but by the time I got there, they said, no, we can't give any more money out now, so if you come tomorrow. And so, okay, so I went tomorrow. Then they finally opened the grocery store, but you couldn't go to the grocery store. You couldn't enter. You had to take a paper and say what you wanted. And you give it to the employee when they're waiting. And they would get your whatever you wanted, cornflakes or milk or whatever if they had it. And then when they had gotten all the food that you asked for or whatever it was, they call your name and you go and pay it and then go home with yourself. So that's how we worked. But soon, after a few days, the grocery stores were letting you in to get your food, to not have anybody getting it. And the 22nd of October, I finally had a little water coming in my faucet. And I was so happy. I had a little warm shower that time for my solar water heater was working, but I had no electricity. And one Sunday afternoon, my pastor from the Mennonite Church said, I'm going to go to Codwis or someone and see if I can use my phone and call people. You want to have me call your brother? And I said, yeah, if you can get him. And so that's what he did, to give him a message that I was still living and the house, my house was okay. And so then left a message in my brother's phone to tell them that I was okay. So that was nice. And he called a lot of other people too, from the families of other people in the church, so that they could get some news from Puerto Rico. But not being able to communicate was really a hard thing for us, because I felt I was nervous because I couldn't tell anybody anything. And I knew they couldn't call me either, because the phones didn't work, nothing worked like that. So, but we got it. And so,
yeah, it was a Wednesday, wasn't it, the 20th, and we were up in, by that time we had moved to Harrisonburg, and we had no idea we could. And then we were at, that weekend, we were at Herb and Sarah's, and we were out of communication there because we can't get cell phone in West Virginia with our Sprint. And so as we were coming back here, this message came in, and on my iPhone, it translates it. So I could read it. Just to say we're taking care of Mim, she's okay, her house is okay, and it was really a relief for me. After all that time, your mind starts thinking, what do you do when there's limited resources, people fighting, or they just had a lot of, it just really, just seemed that the community worked well. And you have, Mim brought home, she came back, she came to Harrisonburg then on the 10th of October, 3 weeks later, and brought with her a little LED lamp, which still sits in her room. Tell us about that.
one night it was so, it's always pitch dark if you don't have any lights on the street, and no street lights or anything, and no batteries, and so it was really dark, and I heard somebody talking outside of my house. So I went out and I said, "Are you looking for someone?" And they said, "Yeah, we're looking for a teacher who I think lives in this community. And his wife died some time ago. And I'd like to visit him because he was my teacher in high school." And I said, "Oh, yeah, I think it's he lives about two houses up the street." So we went up the street and saw her teacher, and she gave him a little lamp, a fan with batteries to get cooled off, and lots of batteries that he could use later on, because they found out in Washington, D.C., that where they lived, that Puerto Rico didn't have any batteries. So they brought a carload of lamps and batteries and had all this in their car. I said, "How did you guys get this here on the plane?" He said, "Oh, I had to really work because they didn't want to put them all on the plane." And finally I said, "Well, I'm a frequent flyer of your plane, so I think I should be able to do this." And he finally gave me permission to bring him to Puerto Rico. And so a lot of people got little lamps to see, and that little lamp really was very good for me when I got mine. I could get around my house during the night, and so that was good. And also the MDS was going to come down there and help, and they did a lot of work in my friend's house, whose roof left, and a lot of other things left from her house was taken care of. And now they say that MDS will be working in Puerto Rico for at least 2 years yet to get everything settled. So they worked a lot at the Britannia School too, which has a lot of buildings, and every building had their house, the roof off, I think it was. The church helped a lot too, because the women got tired of doing all this washing of clothes by hand, and so, because nobody had water and nobody had electricity. But the church had got water pretty good, pretty fast, and they also had electricity because they lived closer to the hospital, and I guess that helped that they got electricity. So they got a washer and dryer, and put it in our, where we used to have our dinners, when we had dinners at the church, and people could come and wash their clothes and dry them. And so that helped the community and also helped people from our church. And so that was a very good thing for them to do at that time. And some of the ladies would also cook rice and beans, so take it to people that needed food too during the time. But they did. Everybody seemed to help a lot. So that's about all I have, I guess. Is there anything else? Okay.
Yes, thank you for sharing. That gives a little bit of a sharing of stories behind our offering this morning, which will go to the Puerto Rico Trauma Project. There is more information about that in the packets. We accept checks written out to MHF. Those will all be collected and then donated, and we will collect them up until the end of July. So if you can't feel like you can do today, there's still opportunity to do after. We have an offering basket.
Not about that. We didn't think about that.
We didn't think about that. Well, that's a good thing to think about. We have a hat. Hooray! All right, so we can pass the hat around. And there, it looks like there might be a basket or a drum as well.
While we're taking the offering, Haiti is another island not far from Puerto Rico, and also gets hit by hurricanes and earthquakes. In 2010, there was an earthquake in Haiti that was just really devastating. There's a STAR program that was begun in Haiti, STAR, Strategies for Trauma Awareness and Resilience trainings. And I had the chance to go and be part of that, to accompany them for a few months. And they call the program Wozo. And Wozo is a reed that grows all throughout Haiti. It's a lot like bamboo, small bamboo. And they use it as a metaphor for resilience because it's so hard to kill. One of the participants wrote a poem, and he invited me to set it to music. So now that we're done with the offering. Devant le soleil, tout réuni, ouvrant la pluie tornade saccagée. Before the eyes of the sun, we all unite. Great wind and rain, tornadoes may ransack us, but we are Wozo. Derrière la journée, yon poème. Résilience campée bien banda. Dans quatre façades la vie, oui, c'est nous c'est Wozo. At the end of the day, a bold resilience stands out proud. In the four facets of life, it is we are Wozo. We will never break. Life is a journey that has no end. Each day, a story comes to life. Each living creature is a marvel. The tongue of this poem has no bones. I walk in the daytime, I walk at night. Just outside my door, heaven's shadow looms. God asks me why. La vie c'est un voyage qui part et bouge. Chaque jour la danse c'est une histoire. Chaque créature la danse c'est une merveille. Parole sa aller la veille Bagenzo. Moi marcher la journée, moi marcher la nuit. Devant portail, moi ciel la bague en toi. Bon Dieu m'a découvert. Bagen parole, mais c'est de j'ai moi cap gardé. Poème me dit au revoir, mais pas oublier, nous c'est Wozo. There are no words, no eloquence, just my two eyes that are watching. This poem bids farewell, never forget. We are don't ever forget. We are
was asked us to read stories from Mark 3 and Mark 5, some healing stories of Jesus.
Jesus departed with his disciples to the sea, and a great multitude from Galilee followed him. Hearing all that he was doing, they came to him in great numbers from Judea, Jerusalem, Idumea, beyond the Jordan, and the region around Tyre and Sidon. He told his disciples to have a boat ready for him because of the crowd, so that they would not crush him. For he had cured many, so that all who had diseases pressed on him to touch him.
When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue, named Jairus, came, and when he saw him, fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." So Jesus went with him, and a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him.
Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease."
While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter's dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to Jairus, the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he had entered, he said to them, "Why do you make such a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, she's just sleeping." And they laughed at him. Then he put them all outside, and he took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in to where the girl was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was 12 years of age. At this they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this. See how well that worked? He strictly ordered them that no one should know this and told them to give her something to eat.
So now I have the pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Paul Leichty, who, as you might know, is our Executive Director of MHF. Part-time plus, I like to say. He's our part-time director, but certainly puts in that extra many hours to make everything work for us. He's been director since 2011 when MHF first came to fruition, starting in Goshen, Indiana, and then now living in Williamsport, Pennsylvania. I've learned a lot about him over the years, how hardworking he is, how dedicated he is to MHF's mission, but also many other things over his many years at work within the church and other communities. Paul's experience with issues of health and faith is a result of his past roles in both family and church. He's a longtime advocate of the holistic vision of health in the context of family and community, having paid particular attention to those who have often been marginalized in communities of faith due to physical, sensory, psychiatric, or intellectual disabilities. He's the father of 2 children, one of whom has a significant developmental disability, and has interacted with a variety of healthcare professionals over the years. More recently, Paul's been involved in advocacy and work to integrate persons with disabilities into the church and community. So Paul has 16 years of pastoral and music director experience in several cross-cultural urban congregations in Illinois and Indiana. He's also worked to help start up or reorganize various community and church-related organizations, such as Congregational Accessibility Network and Anabaptist Disabilities Network. He also has spent 4 years working with Mennonite.net, which helps congregations and church-related organizations with digital communications and marketing, which I've had the pleasure of learning a lot from him with those skills in MHF. And now we'll get to hear from him speaking on salvation, therapy, cure, and health. So welcome, Paul Leichty.
On the night of December 15th, 2016, I lay in the intensive care unit of Williamsport Regional Medical Center, hooked up to a maze of tubes, medical devices, and machines, teetering between life and death. A week earlier, in the wee hours of the morning of December 8th, I had gone to the emergency department with pain radiating up both shoulders into my neck and head. After a number of tests, the medical staff diagnosed me with muscle spasms and sent me home. The next day, when my symptoms hadn't improved, I went to the local urgent care facility just blocks from our home, a home that we had just moved to 2.5 weeks earlier. Well, it didn't take long before I was in an ambulance en route back to the hospital, told that I was having a heart attack. By then, it was 40 hours in duration. That's about the last thing I remember for the week that followed. What I was later told was that I had 1 stent inserted in the catheter lab. Then I developed ventricular fibrillation and other heart arrhythmias, which gravely complicated matters. I had several more heart attacks and was repeatedly shocked back into rhythm. I was hooked up to extracorporeal membrane oxygenation, or ECMO, a machine that took blood from my veins and pumped it back into my arteries, bypassing the heart and thus allowing it to rest. By December 15th, the medical staff at Williamsport Regional Medical Center determined that they were at the end of the resources they could offer me. So in situations like this, the question becomes, what do you do now? What happens when you come to the end of the road, so to speak? Where do you go when the lifeline is failing? Where do you go when you are ill? The doctors have tried everything and nothing seems to work. Where do you go when the medical folks say you are dying? Where do you go when you seemingly have no other options? In the gospel accounts, we have a number of stories where people in the first century faced this kind of dilemma, albeit in a very different way than I did in December of 2016. The Gospel of Mark in particular introduces Jesus as a person who is able to heal people that no one thought could be healed. And so people started coming from near and far. In Mark 3, 9, and 10, we read that Jesus told his disciples to have a boat ready for him because of the crowd, so that they would not crush him. For he had cured many, it says, so that all who had diseases pressed upon him to touch him. People came from miles around seeking to be healed from their illness or condition. They came out of such desperation that it threatened to crush Jesus himself. They came to be saved from death itself. Then 2 chapters later in Mark, we have a passage in which we find 2 prime examples of this end-of-the-road desperation. A story within a story. In the first story, we have a synagogue leader with a critically ill daughter. Now, one of the things that makes this remarkable is that many synagogue leaders were not exactly on friendly terms with Jesus these days. And yet this man, Jairus, came up to Jesus, fell at his feet, and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." The other story is of an anonymous woman with a bleeding condition. And even though she was not supposed to be even out in public with her condition, she made her way through the crowd to simply touch Jesus' clothing in her desperate attempt to be healed. So what is it that people are seeking in this desperate quest for healing? Is that the same thing I was seeking in those occasional moments on the night of December 15th, 2016, when I came out of sedation enough to know a little bit of what was happening? Is it the same thing that the medical team in Williamsport was seeking for me as their patient when they decided to call in the medevac helicopter and fly me to Presbyterian Hospital at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center? I want to explore some answers to these questions by looking at the language of healing that is used in these biblical stories, as well as reflecting on my own story. I want to focus on 4 specific words in the original Greek language in which the Gospels were written. I've translated those 4 words into the 4 key words of the title of this message. And yet all 4 words have been translated in some English Bibles with some form of the word heal. And this suggests that these 4 words bring different nuances of meaning to our understanding of healing. Understanding those nuances, I would suggest, as illustrated in these stories, can help us move toward a fuller understanding of the meaning of healing in the ministry of Jesus. And that understanding has profound implications for how the church, as well as individual Christian healthcare professionals, carry out God's ministry of healing in our world today. First of all, we return to the 2 verses in which Mark sets the context for Jesus' healing ministry. In Mark 3:10, when he says that Jesus had cured or healed many, we have the Greek word therapeo, from which we get our word therapy. In today's healthcare systems, therapy refers to treatment intended to relieve or heal a disorder. So the leader's daughter had a disorder. She was sick and dying. The woman had a bleeding disorder, which made her unclean. I had a heart disorder, which led to heart damage and irregular rhythms. Thus, treatment was applied. Therapy was given to relieve or heal the disorder. Now, looking back, I had some amazing therapies that have enabled me to be restored to the level of health I enjoy today. The heart catheterization lab became a place of therapy. And the most notable objects of that therapy were the stents that opened up the blood vessels in my heart so that blood could flow freely through them again. Then there was that high-tech ECMO machine, which allowed my heart time to rest. There were medication therapies, nursing treatments, respiratory therapies, and later the long needles inserted into my back to draw out hundreds of milliliters of fluid from around my lungs. Then when I was well enough to return to Williamsport for rehab, there was physical therapy to regain strength in bedridden muscles. Occupational therapy to do such mundane things as dress myself. Psychological therapy to ascertain if my brain was still functioning as before. Speech therapy to counter the effects of breathing tube down my throat for so many days. And more respiratory therapy to counteract the toxic effects to my lungs of a drug that was supposed to treat my heart arrhythmias. Today we would probably distinguish between the treatment or therapy and its intended effect of healing. However, Mark 3:10 says that Jesus had cured or healed or literally applied therapy to many. So what is at the root of this word for therapy? Well, according to some scholars, the root concept of the Greek word therapeo is to serve. Thus, to provide said therapy is to serve in the process of healing. To be a therapist is to give one's time, talents, energies, and skills in service for the healing of another. It is to give a piece of one's own life for the life of another. And so when Mark says that Jesus healed, or literally therapied, many, he was writing about Jesus giving his life for the healing of the world. For the life of the world, Jesus gave his life. And as followers of Jesus, we are called to give of our lives in healing service to a broken and hurting world. Again, I can't begin to count the number of therapists or servants of healing who gave of themselves so that I can stand before you today. To be a Christian healthcare worker is to realize that we do as Jesus did, carrying out the role of a therapist, a life-giving servant to those whom we treat. So our first healing word, therapy or service. Secondly, we find the second of these healing words in connection with what happened to the woman with the condition of bleeding. When she touched the clothes of Jesus, Mark says she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Other versions translated healed of her affliction, or even freed from her suffering. Here is another Greek word, iaomai, means to cure or to restore, to bring freedom from the suffering of the disease or condition. Now, in English, we sometimes talk about being restored to health. And so this woman was freed of her chronic disease, cured, healed, restored to health. And yet, this meaning of healing has more implications than just being restored to physical health. You see, because of the Old Testament purity laws surrounding a woman's menstruation, a condition of chronic bleeding meant that she was continually impure. This would make anyone who she was in contact with impure. This would make her unwelcome in public. Her family would need to keep their distance. She would have been essentially an outcast in her own community. And so to restore her to health was not just a cure in the physical sense of stopping or drying up her bleeding, to use a literal translation of another word. By touching the hem of Jesus' cloak, she could again be in touch with her family, friends, her community. She was restored to her community. By being restored to community, she would have also experienced an emotional and spiritual restoration. She no longer had to be troubled about why she had to suffer such a condition ongoing, such a chronic condition. She no longer needed to worry about being ostracized by her community. She was no longer prevented from going to the temple to worship God. Her healing was a complete cure of mind, body, spirit, and relationships. She was instead restored to the fullness of health. This sense of complete healing is conveyed through yet a third word. Oh, I'm sorry. I have another thing to say about that. It's really impossible for me to fully assess or express the healing effects of being a part of a loving Christian community. So for me to be restored to community had many aspects. Having Twyla by my side in Pittsburgh and knowing that many miles away, out of their way, people were making her presence possible by taking care of things back at home, that was to be in touch with my community. Seeing family members and friends who traveled many miles out of their way to visit me in Pittsburgh, when I could even hardly even speak, was priceless. And then to come back to Williamsport for rehab, even though it had only been my hometown for less than a month when I flew away, was to be restored, nevertheless, to my community. To come back home after rehab to a house that I had just barely moved into was still to be restored to my community, to my home. To worship at Agape Fellowship, even though I could just barely call it my church, was nevertheless an emotional experience. And as the summer progressed, to be present in Goshen at my former church, at last year's annual gathering at Laurelville, to be reunited with my sister who would make countless phone calls on my behalf from California and Illinois, well, it was simply amazing. And then there was the reading of those emails about me, realizing the impact of many prayers. Those were the prayers of the community, part of God's healing, restoring work. To be cured, to be healed, is to be restored to the relationships that mean the most, the relationships at the core of our life in Christ. This sense of complete healing is conveyed through yet a third word in which Jesus affirms this woman's healing. It comes at the end of chapter 5, verse 34. Jesus says, "Go in peace and be healed of your disease." This is yet another word, the word hugies, from which we get our English word hygiene. The word carries the implications of a complete health and wholeness. For many people today, hygiene carries the implications of cleanliness and sanitation. And yet its dictionary definition is much broader than that. Hygiene or hygienics is defined as a science that deals with the promotion and preservation of health. And the second definition is the conditions and practices that serve to promote or preserve health. Now, certainly sanitation and cleanliness is a big part of hygiene, promoting and preserving health. It's a big part of the underlying reason for the purity laws in the Old Testament. But good hygiene is more than just an obsessive, compulsive desire to be clean. And hygiene is much more than the absence of disease. Hygiene also involves eating right, exercising appropriately, avoiding harmful substances, promoting healthy relationships with others and with God. To consider carefully the full implications of this word, hygiene, we need to realize that my hygiene and health is also bound up with your hygiene and health. If the water in our community is contaminated, none of us will have good hygiene. If the food we buy has a residue of chemical pesticides that are not easily washed away, then anyone who eats that food has the potential to become ill. If the air we breathe is filled with pollutants, the health of all who breathe that air is affected. So this particular word for healing is about the total overall health of the whole person in the whole community. This is reinforced when Jesus says, "Go in peace and be healed of your disease." The word for peace here is the word that is used to translate the Old Testament Hebrew word shalom. In the Bible, peace or shalom is never just about the absence of conflict. When the Jews greeted each other or said goodbye to each other saying shalom, they weren't saying, "Well, I hope you don't get in any conflicts with your family." They were wishing each other a total sense of well-being. Good physical health, an emotional sense of well-being, healthy relationships, and most of all, God's blessing over it all. Shalom in its fullness is a wholeness and well-being of human life in community as God originally intended it. Freedom from sin, from sickness, from disease, from conflict, from all the suffering and consequences that go with the human condition. And so we too participate in a healing ministry as we seek the shalom, the hygiene of health, not only for ourselves, but for all of the persons in the community. Now, Now I confess that before my cancer in 2014 and my heart attack in 2016, I thought of myself as a pretty healthy person, striving to live a healthy lifestyle. I walked or biked the 8 blocks to work while I lived in Goshen whenever possible. In the winter, my exercise was shoveling snow by hand. Starting about 10 years ago, I made a conscious effort to bring down my cholesterol, lose weight by modifying my diet. I was proud of the fact that I had brought my cholesterol down to where I didn't need statins anymore. I thought I was appropriately dealing with the stress in my life. And so neither I nor the physician assistant who had treated me in the emergency room thought I fit the profile for being at risk of a heart attack. And yet it happened. Whether it was hereditary or too many hamburgers over the years or internalizing more stress than I realized or some other combination of factors, it's not clear. And yet I, as a white, middle-class, North American male, did not defy the statistics. The diseases of my country and my class and my kin and my gender were now my diseases. I now need to take further steps that include diet and exercise and the addition of regular prescription medications. And then medications, of course, bring their own consequences. I now have plenty of first-hand experience with how treating one set of life-threatening conditions can bring with it possible side effects that can also be life-threatening. The disruption in the hygiene and health and shalom has implications that cannot be magically fixed by a pill. And so, although I came home from rehab in mid-January of 2017, I still spent most of January and February in the hospital. A medication to treat my heart arrhythmias was toxic to my lungs. It had a half-life of 45 days. Then a blood thinner that I was on caused excessive bleeding. And then, of all things, when in the summer, several weeks after, both my cardiologist and my primary care physician said, "Why didn't we put you on statins?" And realized their oversight and then remedied it, I was back in the hospital again with what they thought was what was it now? It was liver, no, not liver, but gallbladder. Anyway, all kinds of tests. Eventually, though, between all the specialists, they decided that it was probably a result of the reaction to the statins. So I went from one statin to another statin. And then finally, my cardiologist, who had put me on the lowest dosage of atorvastatin, said, "Well, you can skip a couple days a week." Anyway, I'm only a tiny microcosm of how we had, as human beings, have disturbed this shalom, this order that God intended, and disrupted and destroyed our environment in which God intended us to live. And so we face those consequences even when we try to remedy them. We are collectively responsible for the toxicity and hunger and disease that unfortunately disproportionately affects those who are already sick and poor and needy. Our world is far from good hygiene and shalom. And yet that is at the heart of Jesus' ministry of health and wholeness. When he says, "Go in peace and be healed of your disease." Three words we've considered: therapy, cure, and health. And yet, even in those three words, we need at least one other final word. And this is the word that is used several times in this passage, as well as extensively throughout the New Testament. It's a word that gathers together all of the meanings of the other words that we've looked at. It's the word for healing that has been used and misused in the history of the church. We see it first in the outer story. Jairus, the leader of the synagogue, begs Jesus, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be saved, be made well and live." And then in Mark 5:28, the woman with the bleeding said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be saved. I will be healed." And in Mark 5:34, before Jesus says, "Go in peace and be healed," with that other word, he first says, "Daughter, your faith has saved you, has healed you." Now you notice that I've used saved and healed back to back. You won't find the translation saved in many Bibles in these passages. But it's the same word in the Greek, sozo, that is most often translated in most other passages as saved. So, for instance, the word is the same one used in Acts 16:31, where the Apostle Paul tells the Philippian jailer, "Believe on the Lord Jesus and you will be saved." It's back in Mark 8:35, Jesus says, "For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it." The different translations reflect the fact that in the English language we have tried to make distinctions between physical health and spiritual salvation, and yet they're part and parcel of each other. We've lost the connection between the peace and wholeness, between health and salvation. But the healing stories in the Gospels show that Jesus, as one who saves from all human conditions of sin, suffering, sickness, disease, climate change, environmental poisoning, conflict, and war, anything that destroys or disrupts the shalom in which God intended us to live. And thus Jairus pleads for his daughter. "Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well, may be saved and live." The woman with the bleeding condition says to herself, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well, I will be saved." And in verse 34, Jesus says, "Daughter, your faith has made you well, has saved you." It's that same faith. Daughter, your faith has made you well. It's that same faith that Jesus calls forth then from the leader of the synagogue as we wrap up this story. When they tell him his daughter is dead and he says, "Do not fear, only believe." It is a faith that seems laughably ridiculous to the worldly mourners who gathered around the lifeless body of that daughter. But Jesus' pronouncement that the child is not dead, but sleeping, is but an invitation to all of us to get a foretaste, a glimpse into the power of the resurrection through a saving, healing ministry and movement of God that breaks into our present situation. And so on the night of December 15 and 16, 2016, I drifted in and out of station. I remember only these three things. First, I was somehow aware that I was being flown by helicopter to Pittsburgh. I really don't even know how. I was aware of that. Then I felt multiple shocks as the medical team tried to get my heart back into rhythm. I remember counting up to 10. And thirdly, I remember praying, my times are in your hands. And I associated that phrase with another phrase, into your hand I commit my spirit. Those words stayed with me in the months that followed. And yet somehow I never thought to look them up, see where they came from until many months later. I found them both in Psalm 31. Psalm 31, verse 5. Into your hand I commit my spirit. You have redeemed me, O Lord, faithful God. And then later, in verses 15 and 16, my times are in your hand. Deliver me from the hand of my enemies and persecutors. Let your face shine upon your servant. Save me in your steadfast love. And then I looked at the overall Psalm 31, and I saw the theme. Probably can be best summarized in verse 2. Be a rock of refuge for me, a strong fortress to save me. Three words, therapy, cure, and health, speak primarily to the present reality as Jesus touches lives in the present moment in ways that at the same time offer a glimpse of the restoration of God's ideal future. But that word save or salvation in the New Testament speaks of a reality that spans past and present and future that we can enter into now by faith. Truly, as we experience the touch of Jesus, even just the hem of his garment, so to speak, we dwell in the hands of a loving Creator God who desires health and wholeness, peace and salvation for us all. And so in these extra days that I have been given, I am often reminded to pray, even in the little things, the complications of life, to breathe that prayer, my times are in your hands. And I do so in the knowledge that my Lord, the great healer himself, uttered his final words from Psalm 31. Luke this way. Then Jesus, crying out with a loud voice, said, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. And having said this, he breathed his last. And so whether I continue to live in this world or die physically, I do so knowing that I am in God's hands. The assurance of salvation that has brought me a temporary healing is but a foretaste of the reality of the fullness of health and wholeness awaiting me in resurrection glory. So we come back to the four words for health used in these brief passages about Jesus' healing ministry, but used even further in the rest of the Bible and in the life of the church today as we continue the healing work of Jesus. Salvation, therapy, cure, and health. Here we get a glimpse of the meaning of healing for our own lives and for our ministry as disciples of Jesus. All the healing words encompass a meaning that goes beyond our comprehension, but we get a glimpse. All of the healing stories from the Old Testament and the gospel accounts of Jesus' healing ministry and the apostles' ministry, to our own stories of healing today that we have shared this weekend, point us to the power of God to bring about a final and complete healing and wholeness in the end. And it is this full and final and all-encompassing healing that we accept by faith. We have seen the multifaceted meaning of healing in the gospel stories, the stories of Jesus at work in both the first century and the 21st. Healing is therapy and service. Jesus' presence among the crowds of this world to give his life to bring healing and hope to others. Healing is cure and restoration as people are restored to the health of body, mind, spirit, and relationships. And healing is hygiene and wholeness, a public health that seeks the shalom of each individual in the context of the whole community. And finally, then, there's healing as salvation. As we, in the final analysis, too, are called in the midst of our own desperate situations, at the end of our rope, to seek Jesus, to heed Jesus' words to Jairus. Do not fear, only believe. We can commit our future into the hands of God. God's resurrection power demonstrated in Jesus will heal, will save.
Thank you, Paul. I think that's a wonderful way to round out the weekend. Brings everything together for me in an interesting way. And you spoke about appreciating the small things, and I have been appreciating that little logo, the little tree made out of the speech bubbles.
Yeah.
To whom do we give credit for that logo?
I submit ideas to our designer, and she comes up with things like that. And
I think that's really just
Allison Steese is her name.
for stories of healing.
Yeah.
It's beautiful. If you will join with me in singing number 57 in the Green Book, that would be Singing Journey. For those like my father who's colorblind and doesn't see green. And for the record, Mungu ni Mwema, the song from Mennonite World Conference, is attributed in that book to the Democratic Republic of Congo in Swahili. This song is attributed to South Africa, and they don't give the language. They don't say what language this is, and I don't know of the dozen or many languages in South Africa what it might be. But I would like us to sing it, if we can, first twice through in this language, and then twice through in English. The words are Mayenziwe, Mayenziwe, Mtando Yako, Mtando Yako. So one more time, Mayenziwe, Mtando Yako. And I'm sure that some of those, like the Ko, Yako, has some sort of click in there that I can't. Does anybody know? Mayenziwe, Mtando Yako. 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 Your will be done on earth, O Lord. 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 Your
I want to give a few words about how we're going to do communion this morning and the orders. The role of the communion wine this morning is going to be played by homemade root beer. That's good for everyone. Homemade root beer from some Amish family in Lancaster County. There are two tables set up here, and what I'm going to ask you to do is to decide ahead before you come down to the tables. Group yourselves in groups of 2 or 3, and you'll come and I would like you to serve each other. So you'll take a cup and put it into someone else's hand. You'll take the bread, put it into someone else's hand. And the words you can say are either peace be with you, or you could say you are known and loved by God, or you can say whatever is, whatever feels appropriate for you as you serve each other. So we'll take a few moments to get the root beer poured and then we'll move on. You can be finding hymn number 87 in your green book, in that same book. I should know too that the bread was made by Daryl. That would go great. Let's go ahead and stand and sing number 87. As we will be serving each other communion, putting peace into each other's hands.
Put peace into each other's hands, and like a treasure hold, protected like a candle flame, with tenderness enfolded. Put peace into each other's hands, with loving expectation. Be gentle in your words and ways, in touch with God's creation. Put peace into each other's hands, like bread we break for sharing. Look people warmly in the eye, our life is meant for caring. As that communion shake your hands into a waiting cradle, the gift of Christ is secretly here, united round the table. Put Christ into each other's hands, He is love's deepest treasure. In love give peace a chance, and share it like a treasure.
You may sit. For a confessional prayer, there's a response for you to join in, which is, Lord, have mercy on us. Christ, have mercy on us. Let's practice that. Lord, have mercy on us. Christ, have mercy on us. Lord Jesus Christ, we are your body, not because we have chosen that name, but because you have given it to us. While we marvel at this great privilege, we also acknowledge our failures. Lord, have mercy on us. Christ, have mercy on us. When through false pride or selfish independence we have said, I am not part of the body, Lord, have mercy on us. Christ, have mercy on us. When through superiority or lack of love we have said, I don't need you, Lord, have mercy on us. Christ, have mercy on us. When we have known that other parts of your body suffer and have refused to share their pain, Lord, have mercy on us. Christ, have mercy on us. When we have seen other parts of your body rejoice and have suspected or scorned their happiness, Lord, have mercy on us. Christ, have mercy on us. When in place of you, the head of the body, we have served our own theology, tradition, or prejudice, and loved only those who love and look like us, Lord, have mercy on us. Christ, have mercy on us. Jesus says, come to me, you who are weary and heavily burdened, and I will give you rest. Jesus says, in the world you will have trouble, but don't be afraid. I have overcome the world. Jesus says, I love you, I want you, and I am with you always. Amen. It was the day of the unleavened bread, the day the Passover lamb was to be butchered. At sunset, Jesus gathered with his disciples to eat the Passover meal. During the meal, Jesus took bread, and he broke it, and he blessed it, and he gave it to his disciples. Take, eat, he said. This is my body. Taking a cup, he gave it to them, thanking God, and they all drank from it. This is my blood, he said, God's new covenant poured out for you. As Jesus directed, his followers have repeated this simple ritual since this night, and we do it today to be reminded that Jesus gave himself to us for our well-being, and that we choose to be ambassadors of God's new covenant, bringing hope and wholeness, shalom, to our broken world. The table is ready. Come to the feast of love. By eating your body and drinking your blood, we become members of your body and your agents in this world. Help us to be instruments of your grace and the ambassadors of your love to all the people we meet. In the strong name of Jesus, amen.
Thank you for leading communion and music again. It's beautiful. So before we have our final words and final song closing the evening, we do have a couple announcements as we conclude and check out, eat lunch together, and make our final connections before heading home. We want to make sure that everyone is checked out of their rooms and has their keys turned in. If you have questions about that, maybe talk to Louise. We also want to make sure we get everyone's lanyards and name tags. We can reuse those for future gatherings. So bring those to the registration table, which will still be set up in the other building. Departures can happen as your leisure. We do have lunch in the cafeteria where we've had before. We encourage you to stick around and have one final conversation and meal together. And take some time to fill out our evaluation forms. And we will collect those throughout lunch and after lunch at the registration table as well. And then I would encourage you, if you haven't yet, to take one last look at that MHF placard sheet. Maybe think about something you enjoyed about this weekend, someone you connected with, or some ideas you've had that you'd like to share as why you will continue to be a part of MHF as you head home. Feel free to write that down. If you don't want to take a picture, that's okay. We'll still collect those so we have the things you'd like to share, or you can find me and I'll get a picture of you with it, okay? I'll be around throughout the lunch, and those can be turned in with maybe your evaluations to the registration table. We encourage you to continue to spread the word about what MHF is about. We have brochures available at the registration table. You can take, maybe bring them to your home congregations or coworkers that you have who might be interested in joining our fellowship, maybe contributing their ideas, their perspectives on how they integrate faith into their work. Thank you, and we'll invite you to the final setting.
You want to find number 76 in your green book. The Lord bless you and keep you. I would like to share a little piece of Psalm 109 before we sing, but two practical things before that. If you would be so kind as to bring your songbooks with you when you come out of the room and put them on the parts up there, that will just save somebody one big step. And also the little cups, would you stack them like on the tables on the way out? We will make sure that they get recycled. Thank you. All right, would you stand for the reading of the psalm and then the song? Excerpts from Psalm 109, again by Miriam. You, O heart of hearts, are the thread that connects each one of us, that defines the interconnectedness of all being. Though we are weak and yet have miles to go, your steadfast love will lead us home. Fear yields itself to love and cannot withstand the light. Just as one lit candle dispels the darkness, each ray of love eases the pangs of fear. O giver of the journey, companion us along the way, then we will recognize your face in each one we meet. Guide us into wholeness, harmony, and balance, that we may be a peaceful presence. Let us give witness to your way, that others may grow in trust and truth. You are comfort and blessing to all who call. You love us into new life.
The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord lift his countenance upon you and give you peace. And give you peace. The Lord make his face to shine upon you gracious, and be gracious. The Lord be gracious, gracious unto you. Amen.
That's lovely. Thank you so much for being here, having us.